Welcome back to another Doctor Who Big Finish audio drama review. Today we're going to be taking a look at the latest release to feature Paul McGann returning as the 8th Doctor in the third instalment of the Ravenous quadrilogy series, which is also a continuation of Doom Coalition, featuring the 8th Doctor's two companions, as played by Nicola Walker as Liv Chenka, alongside Helen Sinclair as played by Hattie Moran, as well as the 11 as portrayed by Mark Bonnard and John Heffernan as the 9, along with George Asprey as the infamous Ravenous. Now, the third box set is always one of which of the 8th Doctor quadrilogies that is really exciting, because normally this is the box set where things start to really heighten the stakes. We really start to see the main plot arc of the series coming to the forefront, and this is normally the box set where we see a lot of action. I think that Ravenous 3 has certainly lived up to that expectation. Much like Doom Coalition, this box set is very heavily focused around the actual plot arc of the series and actually directing it towards the fourth and final box set that will of course be coming out at the very end of this year. Now, of course, previously in my Big Finish reviews I have of course already reviewed both Ravenous 1 and Ravenous 2, so if you haven't checked out those reviews already, I do highly recommend doing so, simply because I have covered all of the stories so far and you can get my general opinion of the actual series as a whole as we kind of have gone through this journey of all of the separate episodes. However, generally in summary of what I have thought of Ravenous so far is I have actually thoroughly enjoyed it. I think that I've enjoyed it a lot more than Doom Coalition, simply because it was less of a chore to listen to. I think that Doom Coalition is incredibly complex in its design, and the actual plot arc itself is something of which I only recommend to the experienced Big Finish listeners, simply because we have Gallifreyan political corruption, we have the involvement of River Song, as well as lots of timey-wimey stuff, and of course the origins of the 11 himself. And I must admit, I can recall needing to listen to the episodes at least twice in order to get a full understanding of what the actual episodes were about. Ravenous is a lot more different. It is a lot more relaxed and therefore a lot more pleasant to listen to. The past box sets have in fact had stories in there that have absolutely no relevance to the actual plot arc itself, so it's pretty much like any other episode of Doctor Who. However, much like with Doom Coalition and much like with Dark Eyes, we have that much more greater and bigger plot underneath, waiting to come to the climax at the very end of this 4-part epic. So first off, and as always, in the description below, I will leave the link to go and buy this release from the Big Finish website. It is currently out now. The physical 4-part CD box set is only £22.99, and the actual download of the MP3 file is only £19.99. It will remain at the pre-order price up until the end of June 2019, and as of that date, it will of course also be available for general sale from other retailers, including Amazon and Forbidden Planet. So basically, if you like what you hear in this review, I also recommend checking out the trailer, as well as the technical and story details on the Big Finish website. I also recommend purchasing it before it goes up in price, because the normal recommended retail, I think, is around £40. Whilst we're actually talking about the Big Finish website, this is the first review that has gone up after the release of the new website. Of course, Big Finish have now regenerated after many years of using the same design. It has now got a whole new modern look. It looks lovely. I highly recommend checking it out if you haven't already. There is also some new and improved search features, as well as different collection tabs, and it's all very nice and modern and snazzy looking, so I certainly recommend taking a look at that, as well as Tom Saunders' actual visual trailer for Ravenous 3 as well, that is also available on the Big Finish and Doctor Who official YouTube channels. Now, something that I'm going to address before getting into the actual stories themselves is that the 8th Doctor adventures have come under a little bit of criticism recently on social media, because recently they have also announced the technical details for Ravenous 4, which is looking to be an absolute massive monster of an epic featuring many different incarnations of the Master, and a lot of people were complaining simply because they cannot just buy that box set. And before I even talk about the episodes in this box set, I am going to say, if you've not seen the previous episodes of Ravenous, then this box set will be pretty much useless to you. You cannot jump on at this point and actually achieve a full understanding of the story. It will be virtually impossible, because there is essentially, I did a little bit of maths before doing this review, including the entirety of Doom Coalition as well as the previous episodes of Ravenous, there is a grand total of 24 hours worth of contextual episode back knowledge that you need in order to listen to this release. And As I'm saying that out loud, it is absolutely insane. It is pretty much one big massive epic universe of Doctor Who, and the plot is pretty much continuous all the way throughout, and it is mad to have one big 24-hour story, but I kind of like it at the same time. It has something about it that is just simply grand. Also at the same time, I understand why it may not be appealing to the new listeners, simply because it is a lot of listening to do. It is 24 hours worth non-stop, as well as the additional behind-the-scenes features, and that is when you can actually listen to a box set like this one. So I think that if you have either the time or the money, or you've been listening since the start as these have been released, then I certainly recommend buying this one in order to continue the story, because well, you've started now and it's pointless ending it before the actual story itself has ended. So much like with the other box sets of Ravenous, as per usual, we do in fact have 4 one-hour stories. There is only 2 writers for this box set, being Matt Fitton and John Dorney. So the first episode is entitled Deep Time Frontier, as written by Matt Fitton. The second episode is Companion Piece, as written by John Dorney. Episode 3 is Legend, once again written by Matt Fitton. And then the series finale is The Odds Against, as written by John Dorney. So it is really good to in fact handle the plot arc for this box set, because you can both tell that they've worked together incredibly well in order to balance out certain aspects of the plot arc within the different stories. And for the actual production itself, the cover artist of the box set is Tom Webster. He's done a wonderful job. The director is Ken Bentley. The executive producers are Nicholas Briggs and Jason Haig-Ellery. The music is Jamie Robertson. The producer is David Richardson. The script editor is Ken Bentley. And the sound design has been created by Benji Clifford. And I must say, this box set, along with other ones of Ravenous, have been incredibly pleasant to listen to, really cinematic and modern in their design, and the actual music itself is stunning. It is absolutely brilliant, some of the best music that I've heard in fact for a Doctor Who audio drama. It feels like a big blockbuster epic that you would see on TV, and I think the music really helps the atmosphere and what the writers are actually trying to emphasise and present throughout actually telling the stories themselves. So taking a look at the first episode, being Deep Time Frontier, as written by Matt Fitton, it was funny because whilst listening to this actual story, I got the impression of a series finale, and little did I know that when I was listening to the behind the scenes after listening to all 4 episodes on this box set, it actually turns out that originally Deep Time Frontier was in fact going to be the series finale for the Ravenous 2 box set, and the episode that we did in fact get previously, being Seizure, as written by Guy Adams, is kind of a stand-in for that story, and it is in fact a really nice prequel because, as it mentions in the behind the scenes, Seizure was an episode set within the TARDIS, and you had that whole idea of introducing the Ravenous a little bit more present than there have been in the previous stories. However, it is a little bit more personal with the Doctor, and it actually creates a presence that the Ravenous are this evil lurking race that lurks in the shadows. They are very haunted and horror in their design, and then this episode basically goes and adds to that, and it is the episode of Ravenous that I've basically been wanting since the very beginning of the series, since we had the introduction of the actual monster. This story makes the Ravenous actually feel like a threat. They feel very dangerous, and one of the most interesting things about the Ravenous is that they are dangerous specifically to the Time Lords. They are a personal threat to the Time Lords themselves, simply because they want to feed on Time Lord regeneration energy, and that creates some really nice scenes throughout this box set, firstly in the first episode and the final episode of the box set, where we have the 8th Doctor almost essentially in fear for his life, along with the other Time Lords that we do of course meet throughout this series as well. There isn't necessarily much of a cliffhanger for the previous box set that leads into this episode. In a way, it does essentially just pick up from where we left off, and it isn't an amazing cliffhanger or anything like that from the previous box set. It was simply just interesting and kind of kept you hooked. However, this story is a really nice horror episode, and I think that Matt Fitton has done a very good job of actually presenting the Ravenous, as well as George Asprey actually portraying them. Very creepy and very eerie in the way they say things. Is very haunting, and there is this brilliant scene where Liv and the Doctor put a Ravenous in the equivalent of a blast furnace, and because they are very clown-like, basically you see this, what they believe is a dead corpse, turn into this grinning, smiling face as it is engulfed by flames, and it almost felt like Torchwood. It did in fact mention once again behind the scenes that they felt like this story was very much on the boundary of how much Doctor Who can actually do with horror. It is quite a dark story. Me being a dark Doctor Who fan, I would like to see them go even further. I would like to see the Ravenous really become dark and eerie and quite maybe deadly in the way they do things, but hey, I can only live and dream. But I think so far for the premise of the Ravenous, they are really intriguing, and yeah, they're a good monster, especially to set around this whole quadrilogy of box sets. Also the companions as well. I've not done my usual talk about each individual character that kind of made an impact in the box set things, simply because there is so much to cover in the 8th Doctor box sets, but funny enough, the first episode is a really good example of utilising the two companions. I really got an impression throughout this story that the Doctor and his TARDIS team have in fact came quite a long way. Helen Sinclair previously in Doom Coalition didn't really have too much development, and I was wanting to see more from her, more emotion, and Ravenous has certainly been the box sets for that, because it is built on the relationship that Helen has with the Doctor, having a very challenging opening box set, of course, because she went off of the 11 previously, and then also building on that bond that Liv and Helen have together, and they do in fact think quite highly of each other. In the later episodes we get a little bit more development for Helen, however this story is more focused around Liv. We get some really lovely moments of her using her medtech skills in order to pretty much do an autopsy on one of the Ravenous dead corpses, which is lovely, and also I kind of got the feeling that this Doctor and his TARDIS team have been through quite a lot, and this story really does show that. It shows that once again they're going on another adventure, and pretty much they're lucky to get out of it alive. We are also introduced to another character in this story, as played by Damien Lynch, and that is in fact Rasmus. Now Rasmus is a Time Lord that has had a few previous runnings with the Doctor. There was in fact a few references to the Doctor's past in this story, so apparently there is some untold episodes that we've not seen as of yet that maybe Big Finish may cover at some point, but there is a few speculations and ideas, or at least suggestions, that this is not it for Rasmus. We will certainly see a bit more of him in the future, which is nice. It's nice to see the Doctor actually building on his relationship with other Time Lords that aren't necessarily those big fours like the Master or like the 11 or the Rani, or even Romana being the president of Gallifrey. We just have the Doctor almost being friends with another Gallifreyan citizen that also just so happens to have quite a high-ranking job. So now moving on to the next episode of the box set, we have Companion Piece, as written by John Dorney, and this episode, there's no simple way to say it other than it's pretty much one of my favourite 8th Doctor stories, if not one of my favourite Big Finish stories in quite a long time. It really hit me in a way, it really created an impression in my mind, simply because it utilises the skills that Big Finish can do to an absolutely amazing extent. And I'm not going to talk about absolutely every single aspect of this story, simply because I went into this episode not really knowing anything, and I came out of the opposite side and I was both shocked, surprised and delighted with the amount of things that Big Finish managed to do in that 1 hour story. Now most interestingly about this episode, we have the return of John Heffernan as the 9, which is of course a previous incarnation of the 11 as the title suggests. I absolutely loved John Heffernan's portrayal in Doom Coalition. He was one of my favourite parts of Doom Coalition, and this story, rather oddly, follows on directly from the events of Doom Coalition in a specific story called The Crucible of Souls, which I've got a feeling was in Doom Coalition 3, and it was in fact a rather complex story, one of the most complex timey-wimey aspects of Doom Coalition, and this episode sees the 9 coming immediately from that episode and escaping, and then we also have the involvement of Alex Kingston as River Song once again, and she also just so happens to have came from another part of the timeline during Doom Coalition. So even though that these two box set styles have got different titles, both Ravenous and Doom Coalition, they are still very much intertwined. A big one massive adventure, and I suppose Doom Coalition and Ravenous are kind of just almost chapter points to some extent, and they do in fact have quite a lot of intertwining elements across both of the 4-part quadrilogies. Due to the 9 having quite a lot of characteristics that basically makes him like a hoarder or a collector, this episode sees John Dorney utilising that skill, and we basically have what if the 9 decides to disrupt the timelines and decides to kidnap quite a lot of the Doctor's companions from the 8th Doctor era, and for that reason we have the return of River Song from Doom Coalition. We have the return of Bliss from the Time War series that is also going on almost simultaneously alongside Ravenous once a year. And then we did also have the return of Charlie Pollard from the early EDA adventures with the 8th Doctor, most infamously episodes like Chimes of Midnight. She did of course then go on to travel with the 6th Doctor as well. And I've not really experienced much of Charlie, however I felt like I didn't need that in this story, that it kind of gave me as much information that I needed to know about the character, and it was really lovely to have an episode that is actually entirely focused around the Doctor's female companions, and actually showing how even though they're all linked to the Doctor and he's the main focus of the story, he doesn't actually need to be in it, because Paul McGann isn't in this episode basically at all until the very end, and this episode is almost the Avengers equivalent of all of the 8th Doctor's companions coming together and working together in order to defeat the Nine's really unusual yet funny scheme. And of course the Nine himself is a stunning character. John Heffernan honestly is on fire once again throughout this story. He's got so many different personalities. He's bizarre and also reminds me a little bit of Moriarty from Sherlock, because he's kind of psychopathic but very, very jokey at the same time. He is a lot of fun, makes the episode really enjoyable. I imagine that if you are generally a hardcore Big Finish fan, you will also like this box set and also like this story in particular, because there is quite a lot of references to previous Big Finish stories and a few references here and there to the external Doctor Who canon from other eras, which is a lovely piece of fan service. I think that this story, in all honesty, is a bit of fan service, but it is brilliant in the way that it has been written, and as I say, really enjoyable at the same time. And even though it is quite complex, I still found it quite easy to listen to, so I think that John Dorney maybe has learnt from Doom Coalition and the way that that was presented and made it a bit more simpler in this episode. Of course, incorporating Bliss into this box set as well. Of course, Bliss is a companion from the Time War, meaning that her presence in the story is a little bit different to all of the other companions, because they all remember their adventures with the Doctor, and then you have a companion that necessarily is a lot different in their personality from what we know, and it does kind of raise but also answer some questions about the Time War series that no doubt we will in fact get a little bit more context to as the next few box sets of the Time War series in fact are released. I think there is one due out later this year, probably around in fact the same time as Ravenous, for maybe a little bit later than that. It is in fact one of those annual box set things. So now moving on to the third episode of the box set, we have Legend, as written by Matt Fitton, and it's kind of your general run-of-the-mill Doctor Who story that has been incorporated into the Ravenous series, which is something that previously I have really enjoyed. Of course, the very first episode of Ravenous did feature Winston Churchill, as played by Ian McNeice, in the World War, a fraction of pilots, and it was a really nice story. Can't remember the name of it though at this point. And then also in the previous box set we had the rather brilliant two-parter being the Strasbourg Christmas special with the Krampus, and it was all very good in the way that it has been written. Of course, John Dorney, I believe, written that one as well, and I think that so far those episodes have in fact given quite a big lasting impression, and this episode, being Legend, is kind of the Ravenous turn of this third box set in order to do that standalone story, and even then this episode does have some involvement within the actual plot arc. So I would say that this box set is a lot more similar to Doom Coalition in its approach, where everything is kind of involved within the plot arc of the series. However, this episode is a bit more distant from the plot arc. It's kind of like a loose thread, but also still does have relevance, and in fact picks up directly from the end of episode 1. So you have episode 1, then you have this gap which is companion piece with the companions, and then you kind of return to the action for this story. So it's a very odd way of doing things, but you will get it if you listen to it. I think that it works quite well, and I actually recommend listening to this box set quite quickly, kind of once you've finished one episode, listen to the other, and then the next day maybe do the other two, in order to just have the full script in your head kind of at the same time, to get a good idea of how this actual box set pans out as one big story as a whole. This episode in fact sees the Doctor and his friends team up with the 11, as played by Mark Bonar. He was previously in episode 1 and we didn't really see too much of him, and this episode basically sees the 11 become a member of the TARDIS team, which is absolutely brilliant considering that Liv absolutely despises him and wants him dead. Helen Sinclair also doesn't really like him, simply because she has spent pretty much the gap between Doom Coalition and Ravenous 1 basically being in a prison cell with him, and they kind of had not necessarily a romantic relationship, but a very close bond relationship, to say the least, and then that has kind of made it a bit awkward in this story as well. And then you have the 8th Doctor just trying to run with it and trying to keep peace between everyone, which is rather funny. But this episode is a bit more aimed around Helen Sinclair as a character, because we see the TARDIS team go to Europe in the 19th century, and we see the Doctor and his companions meet up with the Grimm brothers, which are of course notorious for creating the Book of Grimm's Fairy Tales and Folklore, which is very much based around myth, which is a lovely parallel that we have with the actual overall plot arc of this series, considering that the Ravenous is originally meant to be a basic idea or a scary story from Gallifreyan history that is a myth, and then we kind of have an Earth version of that where we have Grimm fairy tales, and due to Helen being a historian, of course she finds the idea of meeting the Grimm brothers a really nice novelty, and it's lovely to see her character actually step out of her shell a little bit more. Mark Bonar as the 11, he's funny as per usual, jumping from his different personalities, he's absolutely mad and psychopathic. However, I must admit, I don't think that this story was particularly for me. It does of course have a few science fiction elements in there. You basically see an alien author that has came from space and wants to basically create an archive of all the Grimm fairy tales, and basically the ship or interface wants to kind of morph the planet into its perfect ideal fairy tale. It's a bit unusual, and also have the 8th Doctor needing to get into the character of being within a fairy tale, so you have him consulting Mirror Mirror on the Wall along with Fee Fi Fo Fum, and the 11 is eating gingerbread, and Helen gets turned into a random creature, and you have bad apples as well. It's all a little bit unusual and a bit mad and cheesy, but I think it's kind of nice. It's got a nice quirk to it because of that, but at the same time it is my least favourite story of the box set. It doesn't particularly have the same impact that the other 3 stories do. I think it will be up some people's streets, but it wasn't really quite for me. But at the same time, I think that this episode is a rather nice opportunity to basically sit back a little bit from the actual plot arc of this series, because I do kind of feel like if this episode was directly relevant to the actual plot arc, we would be hitting a little bit of a Doom Coalition scenario where it is basically constantly on a high all the way throughout, constantly related to the plot arc, and basically everything is a bit too much to take in. I kind of feel like this story being slap bang as episode 3, right before the finale, I kind of feel like this episode is essentially the Doctor Who equivalent to the calm before the storm. It's a nice opportunity just to sit back, have a Doctor Who story that's kind of fun and enjoyable, and basically just wait for the finale to kick in, because it is going to be quite a bumpy ride. And with that said, now moving on to the series finale, episode 4, being The Odds Against, as written by John Dorney. Now this episode once again sees the return of the Ravenous, which is expected, considering that this is now episode 4 of the 3rd volume. We only have 1 box set to go, therefore we kind of need to start not necessarily wrapping up the plot, but kind of just introducing the last few pieces before we get to the series finale, which I'm imagining is probably going to have a lot more focus around the Master as opposed to the Ravenous themselves. And this box set, basically the major selling point even of this story, is a multi-11-9 story. Of course, previously in episode 2 companion piece we had John Heffernan as the 9. This story is a continuation of episode 2, where we once again have the 9 returning, however accompanied by Mark Bonar as the 11. So we have the 11 meeting the 9. It's like a multi-Doctor story, but on another level entirely, because you don't just have 2 entities meeting, because you have the 9 and the 11, but because both of these characters are essentially absolute nut jobs, you have both of their personality sets also interacting. So you essentially have 20 personalities arguing with each other within 2 characters, and both of them switching from their personalities. And I didn't quite realise this whilst listening, as that is all it needed to cover, But this story once again works quite well. I think that it's not necessarily too complex, even though it sounds like it is. I think the way that it has been written by Dorney, it's very good, very sassy. I love his comedy, it's really funny and constantly made me laugh all the way throughout. And this episode is that novelty, because you do need to have the 9 and the 11 meeting at some point, simply because John Heffernan and Mark Bonnar are phenomenal actors, and I think that them in the room together is just a brilliant thing that had to happen at some point, and it definitely pays off, because you have so many comedic moments, but you also have the 9 arguing with the 11's version of the 9, and then the 8 talking to the 8, and then the 9's ideas of basically mass domination against the 11's ideas of mass domination, and basically everything goes absolutely all over the place, because both of them have different ideas of what they want to do. Meanwhile, the earlier incarnations are within the 9 and the 11, trying to kind of plot against them. Meanwhile, you have the innocent 1 and 2 inside them, kind of just wishing that both of them will pack in and start being nice again, because they are essentially these personalities that kind of had the short end of the straw, because they were the good ones, and then the rest after them were absolute mentalists. And then of course you've got the 6 as well, who constantly wants to blow up and kill everything, which is funny as hell, because he's just constantly saying things that is really deadpan, but deadly, and quite serious and dark at the same time. It's definitely up my street. I really did enjoy it. The actual episode itself is basically around this Moon Fortress planet thing, and you have the Doctor and his companions being put on this planet essentially, once again in a standard Doctor Who story setting. However, all of a sudden the Ravenous come along, and we basically have the Doctor being terrified for his life. Meanwhile, the 9 has set up this plot to basically capture the 8th Doctor, and then the 11 just wants to kind of escape and basically go wherever in the universe and cause chaos. And here we have a wonderful moment where the 8 actually, or the 8th Doctor even, is actually terrified for his life, and he says something, Rassilon, God help me, and you actually feel like there is innocence in his voice, and there is vulnerability. He genuinely doesn't know what to do, and his companions are the ones that actually need to look at him and say, Doctor, like, calm down, like, let's sort this out, let's think this through. Whilst the Doctor's having a little bit of a meltdown, you certainly see that more movie version of the 8th Doctor that is a lot more vulnerable and emotional, which is something that I certainly want to see a lot more of in the Time War series. I essentially want to see this emotional Doctor being ripped apart into a warrior, because that is what I think the Paul McGann Doctor deserves, and it is just a brilliant novelty once again that we've had a Doctor that has basically came from one American movie that wasn't particularly any good, and then they've gone and expanded his universe out to essentially one of the biggest eras in Doctor Who history, where you have Lucy Miller, Charlie Pollard, Chris, then you have Liv Chenka, then you have Sullivan from Dark Eyes, or whatever her name is, the Alex McQueen Master, the 11. You have so much going on, and not to mention the Time War in there as well. It is one big massive era, and I think that Big Finish just generally deserve a lot of credit for turning this Doctor, that was even questioned as canon at some point, into possibly one of my favourite Doctors. I quite like him. I think that 8 is really growing on me, simply down to Big Finish, much like how 6 has grown on a lot of people with Big Finish as well, because both of them work so well within the audio drama format. And that is that. That is all that I'm actually going to talk about for the story itself, simply because I don't want to mention any more of the key aspects of the plot. I want to give you the rest to kind of go away and listen to yourself. Generally, as I said at the very start of this review, if you've not listened to Ravenous 1 or Ravenous 2, buy those stories first at least before going into this one, because you will stand absolutely no chance of getting a full understanding of all 4 stories in this release. If you have the care or the chance to actually go back and listen to the entirety of Doom Coalition as well, in order to get the origin story for the 11 and the 9, as well as the River Song relationship with the companions, I certainly recommend doing so. But yeah, it is one of those things that is certainly for the more hardcore Big Finish listeners, as opposed to those listeners that will pick up the odd release here and there. And that said, moving on to the actual final box set for Ravenous. I can't believe it is the end already. Honestly, it felt like Ravenous just started a few minutes ago with the Candyman, which was a fun adventure and romp as well. But we have, for of course, the fourth box set, the return of Eric Roberts as the Master for the first ever time, interacting with the 8th Doctor since the movie back in 1996. We have Mark Bonnard as the 11, we have Michelle Gomez as Missy, and then we do of course also have Derek Jacobi as the War Master, and of course Geoffrey Beevers as the Decaying Master as well. So it is one big monster box set, and I've got a feeling, well, there's going to be quite a few cameos in there. I feel like this, but I don't quite know how they are going to actually pack this into one box set. I do worry that maybe Big Finish have bitten off more that they can chew. It's going to be quite a challenge to actually pull it off, but I think that if they do pull it off, it's possibly going to be one of the best Big Finish box sets in quite a long time, and certainly one of which that is worth looking out for. Or it is going to be a little bit of a complex flop, and it might get a little bit too over itself and be a bit too complex, and everything might just go out the window a little bit. So fingers crossed the latter doesn't happen, but I just think that so far we've had 3 box sets that have seemed very promising with the Ravenous, and I'm just looking forward to that 4th and final box set to see exactly how they're going to conclude the series, and maybe even explain what is next for the 8th Doctor. So thank you very much for watching this review. I hope you have enjoyed it. If you have any questions about Ravenous, then please do leave them in the description below, and I will reply to them at some point in the near future. And stay tuned for more Doctor Who content absolutely every single week on the Husk Productions. So yeah, thank you for watching. I shall see you all next time. Bye for now.